Let's go now, a little life out here. What the hell's going on out here?
It's a lot of fun. Keep it fun.
Hello everybody, welcome to the UK Packers podcast. As usual, I'm your host at Steve Diddy NFL on Twitter, and of course follow the group at UK Packers. And what a title of this podcast. So usually I have my jingles and, you know, a bit of comedy, a bit of lightheartedness, some Packers news. But this was something that I stumbled across during the week. Someone on Twitter, I don't know who it was, put this up, and I looked at the tweet and I was like, no, I've never heard of that. That's not a thing. And I looked it up and it's totally a thing. The Packers drafted one of the most notorious serial killers in US history, Randy Woodfield. So I'm going to tell the story of him coming to Green Bay and what he went on to do. Now, from the outset, you know, there's conjecture, there's allegedness all over the place about when Randy Woodfield's crime spree started. And there's cold cases that he's been pulled up on. And some of that stuff from doing my research for this podcast is really surprising. But one thing that is for sure that I've read about is that there's two very conflicting opinions. One from the Packers who, you know, say they don't remember him. Those that do remember him, and, you know, Cliff Crystal even interviewed him when he was a rookie. You know, not enough lot of people remember him. He was drafted late by the Packers and he was cut in training camp. So for the Packers, he was effectively a nobody. He was gone quickly. He ended up playing locally. People say that he did that because he wanted to be recognised by the Packers again and potentially be brought back into the team. But one thing is for sure, that Randy Woodfield himself certainly identifies with his past and his past as a Packer. I'll explain that a little bit later. But, and this is chilling stuff. You know, it's one of these podcasts. After this, I'm going to go and have a shower and try to wash this podcast off me because it's creepy, it's sordid, and a word of warning, it's not suitable for work or to have kids. So if you've got kids in the car or you listen on the way to work or whatever, I'm going to spare you the really bad details, and I'm going to try use different words for some crimes, and you'll kind of get the gist. And on the outset, I have to say, I did research for this and I had timelines in and crimes, quotes, all of these things. And I came across a brilliant article on Sports Illustrated. So if you just type in Randy Woodfield, that article will come up. And then I you know, filled in my info with some great content from that article. So that's definitely one to go to if you want to read more, and you kind of want more detail on it, let's say. I will try skirt around the really bad stuff, but this guy was a heinous, horrible human being, and he's still alive. He's still locked up, and just a terrible, terrible guy. So I can't sugarcoat what he did. But certainly I can, you know, try spare the grisly details. Anyway, he became known as the I-5 killer. You know, they sort of pin murders on him he's only been convicted of one, but they pin murders from anywhere between 18 to 44. So we see him as kind of this guy who, you know, middle class background. Alarm bells started to ring a bit because one thing about Randy Woodfield is that he has an insane sexual perversion. So from a very young age, he's getting brought up with indecent exposure. And his crimes later on are of an even more heinous nature along those lines. But from a very early age, and there's no way to put it, he was exposing himself to women, the girls. And in fact, he was sent to therapy in high school. And the therapist looked at it and said it was harmless. It was part of being a teenager. He was fine. But we see later on that that's definitely not the case. His high school team at the time kind of brushed over it and didn't want to talk about it. And again, he was 18. You know, his crime rap, his, you know, litany of stuff that he got done for was expunged. So when he went to community college and then he went on to play for Portland State, all of the things that he did were kind of, you know, brushed under the rug. They were expunged because he was overage. Went on to play for the Portland State Vikings. Apparently was a very good wide receiver, good hands. But there's quotes in the Sports Illustrated article from Ron Stratton, and he himself a young guy, trying to get on in the job. He was the head coach. He said there was one thing that he said when scouts came up to him, and that was that he was scared of being hit. So one thing that we see, when an awful lot of serial killer is this charisma, this obsession with their looks, this narcissism, and certainly that seems to fit the bill with Randy Woodfield. He was narcissistic to a fault. Universally described as a good-looking guy. He's a handsome fella. But there was, I think the quarterback I read had said that he was more obsessed with his looks and how he looked as opposed to, playing on the field. And they said that sort of, fear of being hit certainly fit in with his sort of soft-spoken, friendly, and he's deemed to be quiet. Bit of an oddball, bit of a loner. And, it's always looked at when these guys are brought up as like, no one ever suspected it. What's weird about Randy Woodfield is that, for the amount of people that say he was quiet, he was unassuming, there's other people on the other side that say he was kind of those things, but you could tell there was something wrong with him. He was off in some way. He was a little bit odd. One of the quotes was coming up with that he would start these sort of random crazy conversation or statements off the wall. And another thing that he kind of did was he separated himself kind of from the team, and he'd always be popping in on the coaches and sort of making friends with the coaches or whatever. So some people are pointing to, what is that he needed that guidance and that camaraderie. And certainly football was seen as a reason why he didn't commit even more heinous crimes, that he would have been doing more had he not been preoccupied with football. So high school, indecent exposure. He goes to community college, goes to Portland State. He ends up getting arrested a couple of times. One of those was for ransacking an ex-girlfriend's house. He was found not guilty by lack of evidence. That comes in later as well. And he gets, a litany more of indecent exposure raps. So by all intents, it's stated that Green Bay, unaware of his past, which is unlike now where, they know what these guys have for breakfast. They end up drafting him in the 17th round, which is the 428th pick of the 1974 draft. And he's offered a 16 grand contract to play for the year. So to sort of put that into perspective, here's a guy, he went to Portland State. He was a wide receiver. He was meant to be fairly handy, but he was working in a burger chef restaurant in Oregon, where he was from at the time that he signed. And the roommates and his mates that were interviewed for this article and other ones were saying that it was such a massive deal for him. He was going around telling everybody, and they felt that he was under a ton of pressure to try and make it big. So he attended minicamp in Scottsdale, Arizona, under coach Dan Devine. And he said to have been, pretty optimistic about making the squad. And we'll see this later on. And not to give you a spoiler alert, but he's cut. But he states that the reason he was cut is because, they were going more towards the run game and they didn't need his skills. And there was a guy called Fred O'Clair who was interviewed for, I believe it's Fox News a couple of years ago on the Mino report. And he was saying that, he was fairly handy, he was fairly good, and he was actually really surprised that he was cut. So, he attends this mini camp in Scottsdale, Arizona. The team send him a first-class plane ticket with a limo pickup to bring him to training camp in St. Norbert's. And he turns down the ticket and decides to drive up instead. Now, really chillingly, you can go onto YouTube, and if you type in Randy Woodfield, you'll see that Fox, or I think it's Fox anyway, that news report comes up, and Mino goes around interviewing people. And the player who, Fred O'Clair, who talks about him, he turned around and said that he got contacted by cold case investigators investigating the murder of a woman in Eau Claire, which would have been en route to camp and fits the timeline of when he was driving up. Apparently she was I think she was going to a university in Minnesota. She was hitching a lift and she was never seen again. So they interviewed him to see if they could get any info to see would Woodfield been involved in that. So the Packers media guide quoted Woodfield as 6 feet, 170 pounds. They timed him at 4.7 in the 40. They said, cuts on a dime, has good hands and catches well in a crowd, fluid and smooth, hustles, and is a good jumper. So he tells friends in Portland that he's doing well. He avoided earlier cuts. As I said earlier in the podcast, Cliff Crystal interviewed him when he was writing for the Green Bay Press Gazette. And a quote from Woodfield after they have this scrimmage with the Bears in July of 74. He says, quote, "I'm pretty excited. I'm just really thankful for the opportunity." So there's various reasons why he was cut. We see that sort of it kind of comes from him is that, they committed to the run game and that he wasn't needed. And then in that Sports Illustrated article, there's something alluded to that's kind of more sinister. But either way, he was cut on August 19th, 1974. So Fred Auclair, who was the guy that I mentioned earlier, he was staying with Randy Woodfield in St. Norbert's. And so he got cut just before Randy Woodfield and they bunked together. So he turned around and said to Woodfield, "Hey, why don't you stay with me in Oshkosh? You can play for the Manitowoc Chiefs, which were a semi-pro team, and you can stick around and play some ball. Why not?" Woodfield ended up staying with him. And he hoped that by being close to the Packers that they might see him and sort of re-sign him. It never happened. And Auclair, in that interview on YouTube, refers to him as a bit of a ladies' man, but tells a story about him stealing and just being generally a little bit odd. So there's no official arrest record in Wisconsin for indecent exposure, but a detective quoted, and this is his quote, "He couldn't keep the thing in his pants." So even he says that there are at least 10 cases of an indecent exposure across the state. But Woodfield took it really hard that he got cut, headed back to Oregon, and it's reportedly then that his killing spree began. So at the age of 24, he had the opportunity to finish a physical education degree at Portland State. He decided against it and took various other jobs. He used to go down to the college, university, and work out with his old teammates. And there was a coach at the time who saw him, and he was a seemingly friendly chap. But some of the players come up to him and said, "Coach, steer well clear of this fella. He's strange." Mouse Davis was his name, so he avoided him. Despite thinking he was kind of nice initially and he looked like an athlete, he stayed away from him from that point on. So early 1975 swings round, and Woodfield is arrested on a spate of sexual assaults and robberies, and police even led a sting operation where they got female officers to sort of pose as defenceless women, and Woodfield went up to one of them with a paring knife, which ended up being an undercover female agent, and so they nabbed him, arrested him, and charged him. Now, he blamed steroid use for poor impulse control, and he was sentenced to prison, and he ended up serving 4 years and being released in 1979. Up to this point, and I'll spare you the details, I mean, these crimes are pretty alarming and pretty heinous. But it didn't stop when he got released. His PSU teammates of throwing him a prison release party. Again, here's a guy super narcissistic after he gets out of prison. He's worked on his body even more while he's in prison, has a muscular physique, so much so that he has a propensity of mailing naked pictures of himself to women. And he even sent some to Playgirl magazine, and they got back to him and even said that they'd feature him in one of their magazines. However, he was never to make it because in October 1980, Woodfield murdered his first known victim, a woman by the name of Cherie Ayers. So police found her sexually assaulted, bludgeoned to death in their apartment with knife wounds to her neck. Woodfield had met her at a 10-year high school reunion a couple of weeks earlier, and that's how they'd reconnected. And people saw them out and about, and so he was initially brought in for questioning. But lack of evidence, lack of reliable DNA testing, he was released. He went on to murder again 2 months later. He executed a friend's ex-girlfriend and her boyfriend and was questioned over those murders of Darcy Fix, who was the woman, and Doug Altig. But again, released due to lack of evidence. They were in their early 20s. After that, in December of 1980, there was a spate of robberies by a man wearing a fake beard, and some described as either athletic tape or a band-aid over his nose. And only a month later, in January 1981, there was a gruesome sexual assault and murder of Shari Hull and an assault and attempted murder of Lisa Garcia. Both of these women were cleaners. They were working at night in Transamerica offices in Kaiser, Oregon. He'd intended to kill the two of them. He'd shot the two of them in the back of the head after assaulting them. And this was his modus operandi. He would do it execution style. So he would, most of his crimes are of initially a sexual nature, and then he will attempt to execute his victims. And he tried to do that to Cherie and Lisa. Cherie unfortunately died, but Lisa Garcia survived. She played dead. He left, and then she called the cops. And there's a story of the cop on his way to the office, and he sees an athletic-looking guy about a mile away, but he deems that, this guy is too far away from the crime scene, didn't think anything of it. But when he heard Lisa Garcia's description, he was thinking, you know what, that could have been him. So after, these robberies and everything else, he's nicknamed the I-5 Bandit because his crimes all along the I-5, I mean, he goes from, the bottom sort of, what do we call it, the southwest of America, all the way up the I-5 to Canada. So they nicknamed him the I-5 Bandit at this point because all of his crimes were located, on it or 2 miles off the interstate exits all the way across the West Coast Highway. So in February 1981, his crimes become even more disgusting and heinous. And most of the details I'll spare you. But it resulted in the murder of a 37-year-old woman, Donna Eckhart, and her 14-year-old daughter, Janelle Jarvis. The crime was in between 2, again, horrific sexual assaults in Redding and in California. If you want any more details on those, again, you can read the articles, but I'm certainly going to spare you. The spree continued. And according to different sources, I mean, this guy racked up close to 44 murders, it's alleged. He was eventually caught by homicide detective Dave Komanek through witness descriptions. Lisa Garcia played a massive part in that to be able to identify him, but more so because he'd commit these crimes and then he would go to a payphone within a mile or a couple of miles and make calls. So between the description, between the payphone call logs, and that sort of put him close to the crime scenes. And also his photo was picked out from a suspect lineup. And then police said, fine, we have enough for a warrant. They went to his rented accommodation where they found tape that matched what was used to tie up victims during these crimes, and also a spent bullet casing in one of his gym bags. So despite, colossal amounts of evidence against Randy Woodfield, he still pleaded not guilty in March 1981. So although there was a litany of indictments charged to him, the state of Oregon only charged him with the murder of Sherry Hull, the attempted murder and sexual assault of both women, and the attempted murder of Lisa Garcia. And there was a few other crimes as well that I won't even mention that were on his rap sheet. It comes up as close as 2005, where they've pinned cold cases on Woodfield through the use of DNA forensics, which have got much better. But all districts have decided not to pursue further charges. They put down the cost to the state. Certainly at the time of these crimes, the cost to the state of Oregon was too high. Also, the DNA evidence at that time wasn't as solid as it is now. And also, they don't want to traumatize the victims that are, survived. And also the families of those victims and the victims who unfortunately lost their lives due to all of these murders. But they did say, if he ever comes up for parole, well then they will certainly try these cases. So they've kind of put him on notice. So, a mountain of evidence against him, DNA evidence, he's picked out of a lineup. Lisa Garcia stood strong during the trial at the time. But the only real defense that he puts up is mistaken identity. So, he sits there in the witness box giving evidence, and he's, apparently a shadow of his former self. He's not looking so big and imposing the way the media have sort of made him out to be. He's very soft-spoken. But despite all that, he's convicted after only 3.5 hours by the jury. And the sentence is 90 years added on to a life sentence. He was 30 years of age when charged. So one thing allegedly remains true about Randy Woodfield, and that is that he is unremorseful. Despite these cases being open and shut, that he's a murderer, he's a serial killer, he hasn't shown a shred of empathy or accountability or remorse for his crimes. There was a woman by the name of Anne Rule who wrote a book called The I-5 Killer on Woodfield at the time, And she details all of these murders and alleged murders and pulls up all the evidence. And it's meant to be a really, really good account of Randy Woodfield and his heinous spree. And when she brought that book out, he tried to sue her for 12 million quid. And he ended up losing that case as well. And an interesting backstory. Anne Rule, she's dead now. But an interesting story about Anne Rule is that she actually did charity work with none other than Ted Bundy. And she's on record as saying that, had she been a little bit younger, had her daughters been a little bit older, that she would have seen Ted Bundy as the perfect man for her or for her daughters. So, I mean, if you want to talk about anybody who has some sort of like first-hand knowledge, she wrote a book about Ted Bundy as well. I think it's called The Stranger, The Murder Beside Me, or Murder Beside Me, or The Stranger Beside Me, I think, if you want to look that up. So, I mean, she's came into contact with serial killers who have been touted for narcissism or good looks or charisma, which again is a real bone of contention with people to refer to these monsters as any of those things. So Woodfield as well, I mean, the Packers, he was he was drafted, he was given a contract, he went to training camp, and he was cut. Rightly so, the Packers, I guess, would want nothing to do with this guy. But it doesn't seem that it's reciprocated, because Woodfield apparently hauled around, every piece of correspondence that he got from the Packers. He still apparently waxes lyrical to anybody who's going to listen to him about his time playing football and the time that he was, drafted with the Packers, and his time, albeit limited, in Green Bay. And, there's stuff in that Sports Illustrated article about how he kept the ticket stub, or the plane ticket that they sent him to get him to Green Bay. So he had that on him. It's just really sickening stuff. And at the end of the Sports Illustrated article, is the thing that really strikes me, was that Woodfield, although he clammed up, like he'd talk and wax lyrical about football and all of this type of stuff, but he would clam up completely when you start to get into more of his, I don't know, the news report called it a dark side. It's a disgusting serial killer, sociopathic, psychopathic, whatever you want to call it, side. And he wouldn't talk about it. But he created a MySpace page in 2006. And this is how he identifies himself on that page. He said that, "I spend the remainder of my days in prison because I have committed a murder along with many other crimes. I once tried out for the Green Bay Packers. The only reason I didn't make it is because the skills I had to offer, they didn't need at the time," unquote. So again, this guy thinks that he would have made it based on merit, but only that they went a different direction with play strategy, that they didn't keep him around. So at the end of the day, the Packers cut this guy. And, maybe football was his way to keep him out of this type of disgusting behaviour that he had from high school all the way up. But I guess they don't really know when the spree started. They don't know if being a football player would have kept him out of these urges. According to the articles and the news things, he still doesn't show a shred of remorse. And there was a detective quoted that said, if you were to let him out, he would repeat offend. Is that he would go back to his old ways for sure. So a really, really chilling chapter that's associated to the team that we love. Not in any way, linked. The Packers didn't know about his background or anything like that. So it's really odd to me that, there's such fantastic history, but then you have the likes of this story, which I wasn't aware of. So again, if any further reading, you can just Google his name and some of his stuff comes up there. That Sports Illustrated article is absolutely fantastic if you want to check that out as well. It goes into a lot of detail on, what type of guy he was, what association that he had with the Packers. There was a Packer scout quoted in the article back in the day who said that he had no idea who he was, and he certainly didn't know he was going to be, or he was linked to all of these murders as the I-5 killer. Again, the higher number of his kills, his murders, were up around 44. The amount of assaults that I've seen, like there's countless assaults. Potentially one of the most prolific serial killers in US history. So yeah, anyway, next week I thought I'd bring you that because it's a weird and crazy, fascinating chapter in history. Next week, lighter stuff. But for this week, that's it. You can get me on Twitter at UK Packers. You can follow the group at UK Packers. Get into the Facebook group as well. Off-season trundles on, but so do the podcast and the content. Thanks for listening. Thanks for following along. Hope you're enjoying them. Do let me know. And until next week, go Pack, go.